The distress signal came through the quantum relay on a Tuesday morning, and Commander Jake Morrison was drinking his coffee when the alarm started screaming through the communication hub of Earth Defense Station Alpha, and he put down his cup and ran to the main console where Lieutenant Amy Sullivan was already pulling up the transmission with shaking hands, and her face had gone completely white. The holographic display showed Kepler Station burning in space, and the station had been home to 40,000 people, and now it was just a spinning graveyard with flames eating through the hull sections and bodies floating in the vacuum, and Jake felt his stomach turn as he watched the footage play out in front of him. Amy worked the controls and brought up the last clear transmission, and a woman appeared on screen with ash and blood streaked across her face, and behind her, people were screaming, and alarms were wailing, and she looked directly into the camera with eyes full of terror and desperation. The woman identified herself as Deputy Administrator Linda Hayes, and she said that unknown hostiles were attacking them without warning or demands, and they were just killing everyone they could find, and the defense grid was down, and life support was failing, and she wanted someone to tell Earth what happened here before the transmission cut to static, as plasma fire consumed everything. Jake stood frozen for a moment, and around him the entire communication center had gone silent, and every operator and analyst and officer had stopped working to watch the transmission, and some of them were crying openly while others just stared in shock at what they were seeing. He ordered Amy to get Admiral Peterson on the line immediately, and to wake up the entire council, because this was not a drill or an accident, and this was war, and humanity had just taken its first hit, and it was a devastating one. Within 3 hours, every military installation on Earth and Mars and Europa, and throughout the entire Sol system, was on high alert, and the footage from Kepler Station was playing on every news network and every government channel, and people across human space were watching their fellow citizens being murdered in cold blood. The images were brutal and showed children running through smoke-filled corridors and civilians being cut down by energy weapons and escape pods being destroyed as they tried to launch from the dying station, and the whole thing was a nightmare made real. The aliens appeared in the recovered footage as tall, angular figures in segmented armor that gleamed like black glass, and they moved through the station with terrible efficiency and hunted down survivors with thermal scanners and killed them without any hesitation or mercy whatsoever. Captain Ryan Foster commanded the destroyer Vigilant, and he stood on his bridge reviewing tactical data as his ship prepared to join 11 other vessels in a response fleet, and the journey to Kepler would take 4 days through hyperspace, and those would be 4 very long days to think about what they would find when they got there. He activated the shipwide intercom and told his crew that they had all seen what happened at Kepler Station, and that 40,000 people had been murdered by an alien race called the Carthac Dominion, and intelligence knew almost nothing about them except that they were still in the Kepler system and they were not leaving. Ryan paused and looked out at the stars beyond his bridge viewport, where Earth hung below them beautiful and blue, and completely unaware of how much everything was about to change for humanity. He told his crew that they were going to make the Carthac regret the day they decided humanity was easy prey, and his voice was cold and hard as he spoke, and around him his bridge crew nodded with grim determination. The fleet assembled in orbit, and there were cruisers and destroyers and carriers and support vessels, and it was the largest military force Earth had ever sent beyond the Sol system, but everyone knew the truth, and the truth was that humanity had been at peace for 60 years, and their weapons were designed for defense, not for the kind of war that was coming. In a bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, Fleet Admiral Helen Peterson addressed the United Earth Council through secure hologram connections, and the council members appeared around her as ghostly blue figures, and their faces showed the strain and worry they all felt. Council Director Marcus Lane asked what their chances were against an unknown enemy with superior technology and a proven willingness to commit genocide, and Helen met his eyes without flinching. She told him honestly that she did not know what their chances were, but she could tell him that the Carthac had picked the wrong species to slaughter, and when Marcus asked what she meant by that, Helen explained that humans had very long memories and had never been good at forgiveness when it came to the murder of innocents. She reminded the council that the Carthac had just declared war on a species that spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other, and they had no idea what they had awakened by attacking Kepler Station. On the Vigilant Lieutenant, Commander Paul Bennett ran combat simulations in the tactical center, and every single scenario ended in disaster because the Carthac ships, based on limited sensor data, were faster and better armed, and better shielded than anything in the human fleet. His assistant, Ensign Claire Morgan, looked at the results and said quietly that they were going to get slaughtered. And Paul looked at her and saw how young she was at barely 23 years old, and fresh from the academy, where she had expected a peacetime deployment and a chance to see the galaxy. Paul admitted that she might be right about the slaughter, but they were going anyway because that was what humans did when their people were murdered, and they did not hide or run away, and they went to face the enemy even when the odds were impossible. The fleet launched on schedule with 12 ships carrying 6,000 personnel into the unknown, and behind them Earth's shipyards went into overdrive and started building more vessels and training more crews, and preparing for a war that nobody wanted, but everybody knew was inevitable now. In the ruins of Kepler Station, the Carthac fleet commander stood in what had once been the main habitat dome, but was now open to vacuum and littered with frozen human bodies, and his name was Thrak, and he was very pleased with how the conquest had gone. He activated his communication array and sent a report back to Carthac space, and the message was simple and confident, and said that human resistance had been negligible, and their weapons were primitive, and their tactics were clumsy, and the Dominion could sweep through human space within a year and claim all the resources and territory they wanted. Thrak had no way of knowing that his report and his casual dismissal of humanity as weak and unworthy would be the biggest mistake the Dominion ever made, because while humans might have been unprepared for war, they had never forgotten how to wage it. The fires of Kepler Station still burned in the void like a beacon of loss and rage, and that beacon would light the way to a reckoning that would be written in fire and iron and the blood of those who thought humanity would simply accept genocide and move on. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system 4 days after leaving Earth, and Captain Ryan Foster stood on the bridge of the Vigilant, staring at the tactical display with a mixture of fear and anger building in his chest because what he saw there was worse than he had imagined. 14 Carthac vessels were orbiting the ruins of Kepler Station like vultures circling a corpse, and they were not hiding or preparing defenses, and they were just sitting there waiting as if they owned the entire system and had nothing to fear from the humans who were coming to avenge their dead. Lieutenant Amy Sullivan looked at her console and reported that the enemy ships were larger than expected and bristling with weapons, and the sensor data showed at least 3 different ship classes, including heavy destroyers and battle cruisers, and what appeared to be a command carrier sitting in the center of their formation. Ryan said quietly that the Carthac did not think humanity was a threat, and they had massacred 40,000 civilians, and now they were lounging around like they were on vacation, and his voice was cold with fury as he spoke. Commander Jake Morrison's face appeared on the tactical display broadcasting from the fleet flagship called the Retribution, and he told all ships that they had seen the tactical situation, and Standard Doctrine said they should fall back and request reinforcements and engage under better circumstances. Jake paused, and everyone could see the rage burning in his eyes, and he said that Standard Doctrine could go to hell because those aliens were sitting on the graves of their people, and the fleet was going in hard using Battle Plan Delta 7, and all ships needed to acknowledge immediately. One by one, the human ships confirmed they were ready, and Ryan felt his heart pounding in his chest because this was it, and humanity's first real interstellar war was about to begin right here and right now. He announced to his crew that they were going to battle stations, and this was not a drill, and they were engaging hostile forces in 3 minutes, and everyone should make their peace and check their equipment and get ready to show these aliens what humans did to monsters who murdered children. The fleet accelerated toward the Carthac formation in a wedge pattern with the Retribution at the point, and as they closed to weapons range, the Carthac ships began moving and breaking orbit and forming their own battle line with casual precision that showed they had absolute confidence in their superiority. Thrak watched the approaching human fleet from his command throne aboard the carrier Dominant Will, and beside him his tactical officer made a gesture of amusement and said in their clicking language that the humans actually came back with their primitive vessels and they must be seeking an honorable death. Thrak agreed and ordered all ships to open fire and destroy the humans and grant them the death they were clearly seeking. The Carthac fleet fired first, and beams of coherent energy lanced across the void, and the human ships scattered as their formation broke apart, and they tried to avoid the devastating barrage, but the destroyer Dauntless was not fast enough. and energy beams tore through its forward shields and carved into the hull and vented atmosphere and bodies into space. Jake Morrison roared for all ships to return fire and target the nearest battlecruiser, and the human fleet unleashed everything they had, with missiles streaking across the darkness and their fusion warheads detonating against Karthak shields in flowers of nuclear fire. Railgun rounds accelerated to a fraction of light speed, hammered into enemy hulls, and laser batteries carved glowing lines across alien armor. And to everyone's surprise, it actually worked. And it did not work well, but it worked. A Karthak destroyer shuddered under combined fire from 3 human ships, and its shields flickered and failed. And railgun rounds punched through the weakened defenses and tore into the power core. And the vessel exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the entire battlefield. Someone on the Vigilance bridge shouted that they got first blood, and a ragged cheer went up from the crew. But the celebration did not last long, because the Karthak adjusted their tactics with frightening speed and began concentrating fire on individual human ships. The cruiser Steadfast took multiple direct hits and broke apart, with her hull fragmenting into thousands of pieces, and the destroyer Courageous lost her main engines and went tumbling out of control as her crew abandoned ship in whatever escape pods still functioned. Paul Bennett worked frantically at his tactical station, trying to coordinate point defense against incoming missiles while simultaneously managing their own offensive fire, and it was complete chaos, and the computer systems were overloading with targeting data, and the Karthak were jamming communications with electronic warfare techniques humans had never seen before. Claire Morgan reported with stress in her voice that 3 enemy destroyers were breaking off from the main formation and targeting the Retribution, and Ryan saw it immediately on his display. The Karthak had identified the human flagship and were moving to eliminate Jake Morrison, and if the Retribution was destroyed, the whole fleet would fall apart without coordination. Ryan ordered his helmsman to set an intercept course and told his weapons officer that he wanted every gun they had pointed at those destroyers, because the Vigilant was going to be a very annoying obstacle between them and their target. The Vigilant dove into the path of the approaching Karthak vessels with all guns blazing, and the 3 alien ships tried to split up and go around, but Ryan kept his ship in their way, and they traded shots at point-blank range, and Vigilant's shields failed. Within seconds, and hits began tearing into the hull. Amy Sullivan shouted over the blaring alarms that engineering reported fire on Deck 7, and casualty reports were flooding in from all sections, and the ship was being torn apart around them. Ryan commanded his crew to keep firing and not let the enemy destroyers pass them no matter what happened, and one of the Karthak ships exploded as a lucky railgun shot penetrated its reactor housing, but the other 2 finally managed to get past the Vigilant. By then, the Retribution had repositioned and brought her heavy forward batteries to bear, and the remaining Karthak destroyers were caught in crossfire between the flagship and 2 other human cruisers, and they did not last long under that concentrated fire. Thrak stood abruptly from his throne, and his confidence was finally shaken because the humans were supposed to be weak and fold under the first real assault, but they were not folding, and they were fighting back with a ferocity he had never encountered in 300 years of conquest. He ordered his fleet to pull back and reform at a safer distance because they needed to reassess these creatures, who refused to die quietly. The Karthak fleet began withdrawing, but the humans pursued them like sharks that smelled blood in the water, and 2 more Karthak vessels were destroyed in the fighting retreat before Jake Morrison finally ordered his battered fleet to break off the engagement. When the guns finally fell silent, 6 human ships remained operational out of the original 12, and thousands were dead, and the survivors were exhausted and wounded and traumatized. But they had done something impossible. They had faced a superior alien force and driven it back and forced it to retreat. The news of the Battle of Kepler reached Earth 16 hours after the last shot was fired, and the response was immediate and overwhelming, as President Catherine Walsh addressed the planet from the United Earth Assembly in Geneva, and her words were broadcast to every corner of humanity's homeworld. She told everyone that their brave men and women in uniform had faced an enemy that thought humans were weak, and thought that because humanity had chosen peace, they had forgotten war. But the enemy was wrong, and the Karthak Dominion had awakened, something in humanity that they had hoped to leave behind. Catherine paused and looked directly into the camera with eyes that had not slept in days, and she declared a state of total war mobilization and said that every shipyard and every factory and every resource of human civilization would be dedicated to one purpose, which was ensuring that what happened at Kepler Station would never happen again. Within hours, Earth transformed completely and civilian factories were retooled for military production, and universities shifted their research to weapons development, and recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers who wanted to avenge. Kepler and the great shipyards of Earth and Mars and Europa and Titan began working around the clock, with their construction bays glowing with the light of new vessels being born. Commander Nathan Price stood in Shipyard 7 above Mars, watching through observation windows as workers swarmed over the skeletal frame of a new warship, and this was the first of the Vengeance-class battlecruisers designed specifically to fight. The Karthak, with every lesson from the Battle of Kepler incorporated into her design. Dr. Lisa Warren was the lead weapons designer, and she stood beside Nathan and said the ship was beautiful, with heavier armor than anything they had built before, and redundant shield generators, and the main guns would punch through Karthak shields like tissue paper. Nathan asked how long until the ship was operational, and Lisa told him 3 months for the Vengeance herself, but they were building 12 more in parallel, and in 6 months, they would have a full battlecruiser squadron, and in a year, they would have 20 of them. Nathan said they needed the ships faster, but Lisa met his eyes and told him they were already working miracles, because the engineering alone should take years, and they were doing it in months, and if they pushed harder, they would start making mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. Back at Kepler, the human fleet had transformed the ruined station into a forward operating base, and ships that could not make the journey back to Sol system were cannibalized for parts, and the handful of destroyed Karthak vessels were being studied intensely by human engineers who crawled through the wreckage, learning everything they could about alien technology. Lieutenant Paul Bennett was part of one salvage team, and he wore a hardened suit as he floated through the shattered remains of a Karthak destroyer, and his helmet lights illuminated walls of strange angular architecture and control systems that made no sense to human hands. He muttered into his communication link that the power distribution system was insane, and it was like the Karthak were trying to make it as complicated as possible. Dr. Felix Gray was the xenotechnology specialist leading the operation, and he replied that different species had different engineering philosophies, but told Paul to look at the energy output, because the Karthak reactors were 30% more efficient than human ones. And if they could figure out how the aliens did it, then humanity would have better ships. They worked for hours, carefully removing components and scanning everything they could, because every piece of Karthak technology was a treasure and a glimpse into how a more advanced civilization waged war, and every insight they gained would save human lives in the battles to come. On the Retribution, Jake Morrison reviewed intelligence reports with growing unease, because long-range sensors had detected Karthak fleet movements deeper in their territory, and the aliens were mobilizing and bringing in reinforcements from other sectors, and the attack on Kepler had been just a scouting force, and the real invasion was coming. He asked his intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Angela Brooks, how long they had, and she told him best estimate was 3 months or maybe 4, because the Karthak were assembling a fleet at a staging point about 40 light-years away, and current projections put it at over 60 capital ships. Jake felt his blood run cold, because 60 capital ships meant the entire human fleet, including everything in Sol system, numbered maybe 30 vessels capable of frontline combat, and half of those were older designs not built for this kind of war. He said quietly that they could not win a direct engagement, and Angela nodded and agreed, but said they might be able to slow the enemy down with hit-and-run attacks and raids on supply lines, and make the Karthak bleed for every light-year they advanced. Jake called it guerrilla warfare in space and said it was not exactly doctrine, but Angela replied that doctrine got written when they thought wars would be fought over colonies and resources, not survival, and they needed new thinking and bold thinking. Over the next weeks, the human fleet split into smaller task forces and ranged out from Kepler, hunting for Karthak outposts and supply convoys, and it was dangerous work striking at a superior enemy, and then running before reinforcements could arrive, but it was necessary, because every Karthak ship they destroyed was one less ship that would attack Earth. Captain Ryan Foster led one task force with 3 destroyers prowling through a system that intelligence suggested held a Karthak refueling station, and they found it orbiting a gas giant as a massive structure designed to harvest hydrogen from the planet's atmosphere. His executive officer, Commander Laura Hayes, observed that it was a valuable target, and Ryan nodded and said it was too valuable to leave standing, because if they destroyed it, Every Carthax ship in this sector would have to travel an extra 20 light-years for fuel, and that bought humanity time. Laura pointed out that the station would be heavily defended, but Ryan said they would just have to be quick about it. The attack was brutal and efficient, as the 3 human destroyers swept in fast with their missiles already launching before. The Carthax defenders could react, and the station's shields flared under the barrage and then collapsed, and secondary explosions rippled through the structure as fuel reserves ignited. Within minutes, the station was an expanding cloud of debris and frozen hydrogen, but the victory came at a cost because one of the destroyers, called the Defiant, took critical damage from the station's defensive batteries before it died. Her captain, Alex Turner, gave the order to abandon ship, and the crew evacuated just minutes before the reactor core breached, and Ryan watched the Defiant's final moments with a heavy heart because it was another ship gone and more friends dead. But the mission was accomplished, and the Carthax would feel this loss. As human raiders harried the Carthax supply lines, engineers and scientists back in human space worked feverishly on new weapons, and the research station on Titan became a hub of innovation as brilliant minds from across human civilization collaborated on ways to level the playing field. Professor Martin Cole stood before a holographic display, showing the molecular structure of a new compound his team had developed, and it was a quantum reactive explosive capable of producing yields far beyond conventional fusion warheads, and when it detonated, it did not just release energy but briefly tore at the fabric of space-time itself. The Carthax invasion fleet arrived at the edge of human space on a cold morning in March and dropped out of hyperspace in a system humans called Haven, and the colony world had been evacuated weeks ago with every civilian transported back to safer systems, and now it was a trap, baited and waiting. Admiral Helen Peterson stood on the bridge of the new battlecruiser Vengeance, watching the tactical display light up with enemy contacts, and 67 capital ships appeared just as intelligence had predicted, and the Carthax fleet was massive and powerful and commanded by War Master Krathok, who had never lost a battle in his 300 years of service. She ordered all ships to hold position and let the enemy come to them, and the human fleet waited in orbit around Haven with 42 ships arranged in defensive formation. And to any observer, it looked like humanity had gathered every available vessel to make a desperate last stand. Krathok studied the human formation from his flagship called the Eternal Dominion, and his tactical officers had already calculated the battle would last less than 2 hours because the humans had more ships than at Kepler, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. He ordered the fleet to begin the attack in standard formation and told them they would not stop until the human homeworld was theirs, or they were all dead. The final battle for Haven began, and the Carthax fleet advanced in 3 waves, using a textbook approach that had conquered dozens of civilizations, and the first wave would break the human defensive line, and the second wave would exploit the gaps, and the third wave would sweep through and destroy any survivors. But as the first Carthax ships entered weapons range, the trap was sprung, and from behind Haven's 2 moons, 30 human ships emerged from hiding with their drives cold until the last moment to avoid detection, and they had been waiting for days, with crews living in silence on minimal power, surviving on emergency rations and determination. Helen commanded all ships to engage and show the Carthax what Earth remembered, and the Battle of Haven erupted across 3-dimensional space as human ships darted between the heavier Carthax vessels like wolves attacking bears. The Vengeance led the charge, and her experimental quantum fire missiles streaked toward the nearest Carthax battlecruiser, and when they struck, reality itself seemed to scream, and the Carthax ship's shields did not just fail, but shattered and fragmenting into cascading energy discharges that overloaded neighboring ships' defensive systems. Helen shouted to target the next one and keep the enemy off balance, and Captain Ryan Foster piloted the rebuilt Vigilant through a gauntlet of enemy fire with his crew, working with practiced efficiency born of months of constant combat. He commanded his port batteries to fire on an enemy destroyer and told his helmsman to roll them 90 degrees and bring them about because he wanted their dorsal guns on that battlecruiser. And the Vigilant danced through the chaos with her railguns hammering at Carthax shields while her missile pods launched spreads of quantum fire warheads. On the Retribution, Jake Morrison coordinated the fleet's defense while simultaneously managing his own ship's weapons, and the carrier had been upgraded with additional armor and point defense systems, transforming her from a support vessel into a mobile fortress bristling with guns. Angela Brooks warned that an enemy dreadnought was moving into primary firing position and targeting the Vengeance, and Jake ordered all carriers to launch fighters and swarm that dreadnought and not let her get a clean shot. Hundreds of small craft poured from the human carriers as single and two-person fighters that had been developed specifically for this battle, and they were fragile with barely more than engines and guns strapped to a cockpit, but they were fast and numerous. Pilot Jack Sullivan dove his fighter through a storm of Carthac defensive fire with his wingman Claire Morgan tight on his right, and they had trained together for 3 months learning to fly in perfect synchronization, and now that training would determine if they lived or died. Jack called out that he was going for the sensor array and told Claire to cover him, and she responded that she was on his 6. And Jack's fighter screamed across the dreadnought's hull so close he could see individual armor plates. His targeting computer locked onto the massive sensor dome jutting from the ship's superstructure, and he squeezed the trigger, and his autocannons roared, sending depleted uranium rounds tearing into the delicate equipment, and the sensor array exploded in a shower of sparks and debris. Immediately, the dreadnought's point defense became less coordinated and less accurate, and the other fighters pressed their advantage targeting weapons emplacements and shield generators. But the tide of battle was turning against humanity because, for all their new technology and tactics, the Carthac still had superior numbers. Human ships were dying one by one and overwhelmed by concentrated fire, and the destroyer Resolute exploded in a brilliant flash, and the cruiser Stalwart lost containment on her reactor core and had to be abandoned, and the carrier, Indomitable, took multiple hits and went tumbling out of control, trailing atmosphere and bodies. Helen watched her fleet dying and knew the moment of decision had come, and they had planned for this and anticipated it even, but that did not make the choice any easier to give. She ordered all ships to execute Protocol Omega quietly and said, "May God forgive them." Protocol Omega had been developed in secret as a last resort weapon that pushed the boundaries of military ethics, and deep inside Haven's planetary core, human engineers had spent months installing a network of quantum destabilizers that could cause a catastrophic chain reaction in the planet's fusion-heavy core. When Protocol Omega activated, Haven began to die, and the planet's crust cracked open, and pillars of superheated plasma erupted into space, and the Carthac fleet, with many ships in close orbit to better bombard the human defenders, suddenly found themselves caught in a planetary cataclysm. Ships too close to escape were swallowed by the expanding waves of fire, and others were forced to break formation as their careful battle plans dissolved into chaos while they tried to avoid the destruction. And in that chaos, the human fleet struck, with everything they had left, and the Vengeance rammed her prow into a Carthac battlecruiser, with her forward guns firing at point-blank range, even as both ships' hulls crumpled from the impact. Ryan Foster led 5 destroyers in a suicide run against the Eternal Dominion, and their ships took terrible damage, but managed to cripple the dreadnought's main engines, and Jake Morrison's retribution covered the evacuation of damaged human vessels, with her weapons batteries working overtime to keep the Carthac at bay. As Haven's atmosphere burned away and its oceans boiled into steam, the Carthac fleet finally broke, and War Master Krathok, with his flagship crippled and half his fleet destroyed or damaged, gave the order to retreat, and the surviving Carthac ships jumped to hyperspace, abandoning the system and their dead. In the aftermath, Helen Peterson surveyed the ruins of her fleet, and of the 42 ships that started the battle, only 19 remained operational, and thousands of her people were dead, and an entire planet had been sacrificed as a weapon, but they had won, and the Carthac invasion had been stopped, at least for now. 6 months after the Battle of Haven, the war had transformed into a grinding stalemate that consumed resources and lives on both sides, and the Carthac Dominion, shocked by the ferocity of human resistance, had withdrawn to fortified positions deeper in their territory, but they had not sued for peace. Intelligence reports painted a terrifying picture of a fleet with over 200 capital ships being assembled, and it was the largest armada the Carthac had ever put together, and when it came, it would either crush human civilization or break itself against Earth's defenses, and there would be no middle ground. Admiral Helen Peterson stood in the war room beneath the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by holographic displays showing the disposition of every human military asset in the galaxy, and the past 6 months had been spent in frantic preparation, with new shipyards built and new weapons developed, and most importantly, humanity had learned from every battle and every defeat and every hard-won victory. Commander Nathan Price gestured at the display and reported that they had 87 capital ships operational, with another 32 in various stages of construction, and the Vengeance-class battlecruisers were performing beyond expectations. And quantum fire missiles had been upgraded with better guidance systems, and new shield technology reverse-engineered from captured Carthax ships was being installed across the fleet. Helen said quietly that it still was not enough if the enemy came at them with 200 ships, and Nathan agreed but said they had one more advantage because they were fighting for their home while the Carthax were fighting for conquest, and that made a difference. Captain Ryan Foster stood on the bridge of the Vigilant, now designated the command ship for the Third Fleet, and his vessel had been rebuilt so many times that barely any of the original structure remained, and she was a ship of scars and patches, held together by skill and determination. But she flew and her gun still fired, and that was all that mattered. Amy Sullivan reported an incoming transmission from Earth, and it was President Walsh with a fleet-wide broadcast, and Ryan told her to put it through. President Catherine Walsh appeared on every screen across the human fleet, and her face showed the strain of 6 months of total war, but still projected strength and confidence as she spoke to the people of Earth and the warriors of humanity. She said they were facing their darkest hour because intelligence confirmed the Carthax were preparing their final assault, and they meant to break humanity and destroy everything they had built and end human civilization as they knew it. Catherine paused and her expression hardened, and she told them the Carthax would fail, not because humans were stronger or because their technology was superior, but because they remembered what happened at Kepler Station, and they remembered the 40,000 innocent lives that were taken. She said that many of them would not survive the coming battle, and she wished she could promise otherwise, but they were at war, and war demanded sacrifice. But they should know that whether they won or lost and whether they lived or died, the galaxy would remember that humanity stood against tyranny and did not break. The transmission ended, but the effect rippled through the fleet as crews stood straighter, and voices became steadier, and the fear was still there, because it would always be there, but it was tempered now by determination and a cold, hard resolve. On Earth, in the rebuilt weapons research facility on Titan, Dr. Lisa Warren made final adjustments to humanity's ultimate weapon, called the Hammer of Sol. And it was a massive directed energy platform built into an asteroid that had been towed into Earth's orbit, and when fully charged it could produce a beam powerful enough to cut through a Carthax dreadnought in a single sustained burst. The chief engineer, Marcus Holt, asked if they were sure it would work, and Lisa looked at him and said they were sure, but the question was whether they would get a chance to use it, because the hammer took 5 minutes to charge between shots, and in a battle 5 minutes might as well be 5 hours. The Carthax fleet arrived 3 weeks later and dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, in a formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers, and it was exactly as terrifying as intelligence had predicted, with 214 capital ships supported by hundreds of smaller vessels all advancing on Earth, with the inevitability of a tidal wave. War Master Krathok, restored to command after his defeat at Haven, watched the approaching human defenses with grudging respect, because they had transformed Earth's orbit into a fortress, with weapons platforms and minefields and ships positioned in layered defensive rings, and it would be costly to break through, but they would break through, because the Dominion had committed too much to fail now. The final battle for Earth began on a Tuesday afternoon, and children looked up from playgrounds to see the sky fill with the light of distant explosions, and people watched from their homes as news broadcasts showed the scope of the Carthax assault. And in bunkers and shelters across the planet, billions of humans held their breath and prayed. The human fleet met the Carthax at the orbit of Mars, determined to keep the fighting as far from Earth as possible, and the Vengeance led the charge, with Helen Peterson standing calmly on her bridge as her ship's guns hammered at the approaching alien armada. She ordered all ships to concentrate fire on the enemy right flank and try to create a gap in their formation, and the human fleet focused its firepower on a single point with quantum fire missiles and railgun rounds converging on a cluster of Carthax battlecruisers. One alien ship exploded and another lost power and began drifting. But for every ship they damaged, 2 more moved up to take its place, and Ryan Foster led his task force in a flanking maneuver, trying to get around the Carthax formation to attack their supply ships, but the aliens had learned from previous battles. Their formation was tighter and more disciplined, and they had positioned fast attack ships specifically to counter human raiders, and Amy Sullivan reported They were taking heavy fire with shields at 40% and falling. Ryan commanded them to keep going because they had to get through, but they did not get through, as 3 Karthak destroyers cut off their advance, and Ryan was forced to pull back or risk losing his entire force. Jake Morrison coordinated the defense from the Retribution, now stationed in high Earth orbit, as the last line of defense, and he watched the tactical display with growing despair as the human fleet was slowly pushed back, forced to trade space for time, and yielding one orbital ring after another. Angela Brooks said quietly that they were losing and they were not going to hold the enemy. And Jake looked at her, and then at the rest of his bridge crew with their young faces and old faces all showing the strain of months of warfare, but all still standing and still fighting and still refusing to quit. He said maybe they were losing, but they would make the Karthak remember the price, and as the enemy fleet approached Earth's orbit, the Hammer of Sol activated for the first time, drawing power from fusion reactors spread across 3 asteroids and channeling enough energy to light a small sun. When it fired, the beam was so bright it could be seen from Earth's surface as a lance of pure destruction that carved through the Karthak formation like a knife through flesh, and the beam struck a dreadnought dead center, and the massive ship simply ceased to exist, vaporized so completely that not even debris remained.